Good morning. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum at the Wilson Center. I'd like to welcome you for today's meeting, Ending Wildlife Crime to Protect Animals, Human Health, and the Planet. For those of you joining a Wilson Center event for the first time, I want to let you know that the Wilson Center is a living memorial to President Wilson, and Congress created us as a think tank that connects policy, practice, research through nonpartisan and non-advocacy open dialogue. There are 20 projects and programs at the Wilson Center covering all topics and regions, and two of them are today's co-sponsors, the Environmental Change and Security Program and my project, the China Environment Forum. Our two programs have had the pulse on illegal wildlife trade issues for many years in meetings and blogs. And a lot of those meetings that I've done have focused very much on domestic drivers within China that are encouraging this trade. And it's encouraging right now that in the past year, we've seen China making some reforms of their wildlife conservation law, but there still remain many loopholes. And there are loopholes around the globe that allow this kind of trade to continue. And that's why it's really important. And I'm excited that we have this group of leading thinkers and doers who are working on illegal wildlife trade issues. I'd like to thank the speakers for coming, and also some of the people behind the scenes that make this all possible. I got Amanda King from Environmental Change and Security Program, Eli Patton from my program, and of course our AV team that's making us shine nice and bright over a year now here on Zoom. And now it's my privilege to introduce the Wilson Center's president and CEO. He's our new president and CEO. He came to us from the Hudson Institute, where, I'm sorry, not Hudson, the McCain Institute, where he was the executive director. Now, Ambassador Green has worked on illegal wildlife issues for many years, most recently as the head of USAID, an ambassador in Tanzania, and then as a member of Congress. So Ambassador Green, I'm going to pass the virtual mic over to you, and someday I'm going to hand you a mic in person. Thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the meeting.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. And let me join my voice of welcome. You know, we were chartered by Congress to, in their words, strengthen the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. And this great program today is very much in line with that charter. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us yet again that the ecosystem health, animal health, and human health are closely linked. You know, while the State Department and Congress continue to push for a deeper investigation of all the causes of COVID, what is very clear are the risks of zoonotic disease. That's indisputable. Roughly 3 out of every 4 emerging infectious diseases in people originate in animals, and many of them are linked to wildlife markets. How can we fail to remember the lessons of HIV/AIDS, bird flu, SARS, and Ebola, and the devastation and too often despair that they've caused? But zoonotic diseases are far from the only cause of wildlife crime and trafficking. They're also driving the extinction crisis, posing a huge threat to biodiversity, second only, in fact, to habitat destruction. Wildlife is bought, sold, and consumed in every country on Earth, with vast implications for not just human and animal welfare, but for global security as well. The Global Environmental Facility describes the illegal wildlife trade as one of the most lucrative illegal businesses in the world. It's actually now the 4th largest source of criminal earnings, generating up to $23 billion annually, according to UN estimates. This is money that funds criminal gangs, armed rebels, warlords, lots of bad guys. Finally, environmental crime threatens communities that depend on local natural resources and are trying to responsibly and sustainably build a biodiversity-based future. African economies, for example, lose as much as $25 million in lost tourism revenue each and every year because of elephant poaching alone. Existing laws and enforcement authorities often find themselves outgunned and under-equipped to give sufficient attention to effectively battling wildlife crime. There are hopeful signs, however. Last session, Congress doubled down on its support for laws and programs and funding that strengthen the capacity of wildlife officials to tackle this scourge. The presidents of Costa Rica and Gabon recently issued a joint statement calling for a fourth protocol on preventing and combating illicit wildlife trafficking, which would be the first time that a crime that seriously affects the environment would be included in the international criminal law framework. In other words, there are challenges out there, but there are also new tools, new technologies, and new learning that can help. What seems clear is that addressing wildlife crime requires a balanced approach that builds partnerships and targets supply, demand, and livelihoods and support for communities that live close to wildlife. Today, the Wilson Center is proud to be hosting this high-level panel of experts to discuss the scale of wildlife crime and trade, its vast implications for national security and human health, and what national governments, and yes, the international community can do to help. Jennifer, back to you, and I'm looking forward to this great discussion.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and so I get to do super quick introduction to my good friend Sharon Geinup, who is a global fellow at the Wilson Center. She used to be an in-house fellow, had lunch with her often, just a National Geographic explorer and just an amazing author focused on illegal wildlife trade issues. Tigers has been her forte. I'm keeping it short because Sharon, I want you to say more, but you're a photographer, journalist, a leader in this field. Thank you so much for moderating our panel today.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. You know, as Ambassador Green noted, wildlife trade is a complex problem. It's an environmental issue, a public health issue, an enforcement issue, and a global and national security issue. Our panelists will provide insights into the many reasons why the lucrative black market wildlife trade is an issue of serious concern, with poaching pushing species towards extinction and dismantling ecosystems, the fact that this is an illegal industry run by international organized criminal organizations and fueled by corruption, with inadequate enforcement and insufficient or poorly enforced laws in many places. And as the current pandemic has reminded us, legal and illegal trade in wildlife creates the perfect environment for emergence of new infectious diseases. So now I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel in order of appearance. Their full bios are online. John Scanlon will kick off. He has a long history working in the private sector, international organizations, and in government on wildlife conservation and protection. He served as Secretary General of CITES from 2010 to 2018 and was African Park's first special envoy. John is now CEO of the Elephant Protection Initiative and chair of the UK government's Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund. Next up, born in Israel, Fir Dori arrived in Cameroon in 2002 as an educator, photojournalist, and activist, and has founded the NGO LAGA to fight commercial poaching. He and his volunteer team brought about the first ever wildlife prosecution in West and Central Africa. The model now operates in 8 countries as the Eagle Network and has brought about more than 1,200 arrests and prosecutions of major wildlife traffickers, now about 1 a week. Peter Daszak, next. He's president of the nonprofit EcoHealth Alliance, which focuses on global health, conservation, and international development. Peter's research has helped identify and predict the origins of emerging diseases across the globe, identifying bats as the origin of SARS, as well as publishing the first global emerging disease hotspots map, and strategizing how to quantify unknown viruses in the wild, and working towards a One Health, EcoHealth, global health approach to health that includes wildlife, livestock, and human health. Lastly, Sharon Burke works at the intersection of human security, prosperity, and the environment, speaking and publishing frequently on climate change, biodiversity, water, energy, and human security challenges. She's just launched a research and advisory organization, Ecospherics, focusing on these issues. Sharon is a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for our operational energy for operational energy, and until recently, directed the Resource Security Program at New America. With that, I'd like to turn it over to John.
Great, thank you, Sharon, and a big thank you to the Wilson Centre and Ambassador Green for hosting today's event. The devastating pandemic that we're currently living through has been omnipresent over the past year. Governments have been struggling to stop it from spreading, striving to vaccinate us against it, and working to understand its origins. And at some stage, we're going to get through it, but when we do, it won't be over. In fact, far from it. According to a recent World Health Organization report, the most likely explanation for COVID-19 is that it jumped from an animal, such as a bat, to humans, possibly via another animal. And our fellow panelist, Peter Daszak, is a co-author of the report, and we're going to hear from him later about this. But while it's still too early to draw any final conclusions about the origins of COVID-19, the links between wildlife and previous pandemics are well known, as are the conditions that make the spillover of viruses from animals to human more likely, including via wildlife trade and markets. Now, in saying so, we must be mindful of the fact that when left alone, wild animals pose no risk to human health. The risk comes from how we, as people, interact with wildlife. And it's not just about the health risk that we need to be concerned. In addition to these risks, the UN IPBES predicts that due to our actions, over 1 million species will go extinct over the coming decades, including due to overexploitation and the loss of wildlife habitat, unless we change course. And climate change is on top of the international agenda. And one response to help mitigate climate change is nature-based solutions. They can offer about a third of the cost-effective carbon dioxide mitigation needed to 2030. Yet habitat loss, the overexploitation of wildlife, including for illegal trade, degrades ecosystems and their ability to sequester carbon. Now, if nothing else, this COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us, albeit in a devastating way, of the interconnected nature of things, most particularly between economies, the environment, human and wildlife health and welfare. And we need to recalibrate our relationship with nature for many compelling interrelated reasons, including to protect biodiversity, combat climate change, and prevent future pandemics. This is going to require profound changes in how we regulate the taking, trade, and consumption of wildlife, how we combat wildlife crime, and how we manage and finance the protection of wildlife at its source. And I'm going to briefly touch upon the first two of these issues today. I'm fortunate to chair the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, through which a diverse array of people and organisations have joined forces to promote changes to our international laws. Our initiative considers that our current international regime for regulating wildlife trade and combating wildlife crime is inadequate in setting the framework for regulating the trade, markets, and consumption that pose a risk to public health, as well as for ending wildlife crime. We are promoting changes to the existing legal framework that will shrine into law how states to commit to work with each other to help avoid future pandemics and end wildlife crime, and in a manner that delivers multiple local and global benefits. And so let me share with you our concerns about the existing wildlife trade and wildlife crime laws in a little more detail and briefly outline our suggested reforms. Our starting point is that these are challenging, global, interconnected issues. Viruses can spill over in any country, and wildlife crime is a scourge affecting every continent. A collective effort is needed to address them, and we need our international legal frameworks to be fit for purpose. Firstly, on wildlife trade. The global agreement that exists to regulate international trade in wildlife, known by its acronym CITES, takes decisions based solely upon biological and trade criteria. It looks to see if any trade will affect the survival of the species of animal or plant that is being traded. Doesn't pay attention to the risk that such trade could pose to human or animal health, nor does it address wildlife markets. Now, this needs to change. Regulating trade in wildlife needs to be based on a One Health approach, where the biological, human health, and animal health criteria are all taken into consideration. And we're already starting to see some states impose further restrictions on trade and markets, for example, in China, Gabon, Italy, and Vietnam. And the WHO and partners have called on national authorities to suspend the trade in some live caught wild animals for various purposes and to close sections of food markets as an emergency measure. But we need a collective effort, and we need to recognise that human memories are short, as is clear from the responses to previous pandemics. To succeed, we must hardwire a One Health approach into the international legal framework. And I'll briefly touch upon two options to achieve this objective. States could adopt amendments to CITES that build human and animal health criteria into its decision-making processes and extend its reach to wildlife markets. However, CITES parties have traditionally been wary of extending its mandate, and they may elect not to take up this opportunity. But there is another viable option, which comes from an initiative of the global health community, and that is to ensure that the scope of a proposed international pandemics treaty includes legally binding commitments on taking measures to prevent the spillover of viruses and other pathogens from wild animals to people, including through wildlife trade and markets. And we've just released a media release on this issue today. Now, secondly, moving on to wildlife crime. In addition to posing a threat to human and animal health, wildlife crimes are driving many species towards extinction, degrading entire ecosystems and their ability to sequester carbon, depriving governments of revenue, exacerbating corruption, insecurity, and poverty. And if we look at all species being illicitly trafficked, not just the limited number of species regulated under CITES, and include the impacts of these crimes on ecosystems, then the World Bank estimates their value at a staggering $1 to $2 trillion a year. Now, further, as more restrictions are imposed on certain wildlife trade and markets, it's going to require an enhanced collaborative enforcement effort to ensure such activities do not simply move underground. Now, notwithstanding the destructive and high-risk nature of these crimes to both people and wildlife, there is no global agreement on wildlife crime, as there is, for example, on human trafficking. We've to date relied heavily on CITES, which is a 50-year-old trade-related convention. Global connectivity, how organized crime operates across borders, and the trafficking of wildlife at an industrial scale requires enhanced global cooperation and national responses. States need to respond in a manner that is commensurate with the risk, and we've released a working draft of the possible form and content of a new global agreement on wildlife crime. Now, there are many elements to this, but it includes setting out the conduct that should be criminalized, committing states to make it a criminal offense to import any wildlife that has been acquired in contravention of the national laws of the source country, and on the exchange of critically important information. It would apply to any species of wild fauna and flora, including fish and timber species, that is protected under any international or, importantly, any national law. And I'm delighted to remind you, because we've just heard from Ambassador Green, that just last month, the president of Gabon, President Ali Bongo Ondimba, and the president of Costa Rica, President Carlos Alvarado Quesada, presidents of two highly biodiverse rich countries, jointly called for a new global agreement on wildlife crime, taking the form of a fourth protocol under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. Now, as the ambassador said, if adopted, this would be the first time that a crime that has a significant impact on the environment is specifically embedded into the international criminal law framework. And if we get it right, the local communities living amongst wildlife and the governments of source countries, as well as our global biodiversity, climate, health, and security, will all be beneficiaries. Colleagues, the world is still feeling the full brunt of a pandemic which most likely had its origins in a wild animal. We're advised that there are hundreds of thousands of new viruses that could spill over from wildlife to humans. We're struggling to combat climate change and staring down the loss of 1 million species. Given the scale of the risk to people and planet, we must ratchet up both our national and global response. And I'd like to finish with a quote from the presidents of Costa Rica and Gabon. They said, "If we aspire to meet our global commitments to tackle biodiversity loss and climate change, as well as emerging efforts to prevent future wildlife-related pandemics, then countries must step up and treat wildlife crime as the serious and highly destructive crime that it is." And today I reach out to all of you to get behind the visionary statement made by these two presidents and to actively encourage other states to heed their call. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you so much, John, for giving us such a broad context on the issue and the legal framework that we need to use to address these issues. Ophir, on to you.
Thank you. Let me just get the PowerPoint connected and yep, Um, so my name is Ophir. I'm the founding director of the Eagle Network. We are a law enforcement NGO, which is a kind of a new animal out there with an innovation approach to fight wildlife crime. So we are in the forefront of fighting wildlife crime, and I'm trying to bring some insights from this perspective. We operate in 10 different countries, and we have more than 2,500 major traffickers that we managed to put behind bars to date. We eat corruption higher levels. That is our daily life. In fact, just before this meeting, we finished 2 different operations just today, one in Congo, arresting an ivory trafficker with ivory and pangolin scales, and 5 traffickers in a network of skins traffickers with 3 leopard skins and other skins. So I'll try to bring this perspective a little bit for the favor of others. From the forefront, we see the connection with extinction very directly. In fact, what you see here is the western black rhino, already extinct. I have seen the last rhino horns moving between Cameroon and Nigeria in the illegal trade. The guy holding a rhino horn right here is called Bouquet. He is a kingpin, and he has started ivory trafficking the year I was born, 1976, and put Western Africa on the map as far as ivory and rhino horn trafficking is concerned. A person like this, a kingpin, on years of work, that specific person that we managed to put in jail is in charge of generating the killings of 20 to 30,000 elephants by himself. This is just an idea of how organized crime is working and how it is connected to the actual dissemination of wildlife. I'll give an example of how ivory criminal syndicates operate. This is an example of the Tang syndicate, a criminal family. What you see here is an X-ray of a 40-foot container. You can see the wood that was declared on export in those piles out there. On the left side of the picture, you see something with higher density, darker. If you look well, you see that the square that represents the end of the container is actually double. There is 2 different squares. If you look very well, you see there is a fourth ending to this 40-foot container. There is a fourth compartment, and those pointy things out there in this black, this dark matter can hint you what was inside. 603 ivory tusks, and this is just one seizure out of many much activity of this syndicate that we managed to clamp upon, and we got an insight to this syndicate that I can share with you. One seizure like this represents more than 300 killed elephants. This syndicate has been doing the same force compartment methods with containers up and down from Asia to Africa for every 1 to 2 months. They were active from the 80s, so unlike maybe the myth about organized crime being a new phenomenon in wildlife trade, most of the syndicates that we managed to attack are actually active from the 80s. A fast calculation of their activities gives us a conservative number of the destruction that they caused of more than 36,000 elephants killed from their operation over the years. That's about 10% of African elephant population right now. To give you an example of how devastating is just one crime family's effect on wildlife. And their operation, of course, was stretching over sub-regions and of course, 1 foot in Asia and 1 foot in Africa. They were activating hundreds of poachers and coordinated them in other places. So the idea or the notion that what we're facing is a poaching or even industrial poaching is not really what we see from our perspective, which is organized crime, and poachers are mere soldiers, the foot soldiers just down in the bottom with not a lot of effect on the actual killing. They were working on protection, on hierarchy, and they operated through a vast and powerful network of corruption. Generals, magistrates, mayors, ministers, members of parliament in different countries again. Not people who you bribe when you have a problem, but actually people who are part of your criminal organization to protect it. Of course, we're talking about money laundering, but also there is connection to drugs trade in Pakistan and arms trade as well with this specific syndicate. And this is just one example of many of how a criminal syndicate operates in the wildlife sector. Another example, as ivory trade is maybe more known, something from somewhere else of how criminal wildlife trade can be. What you see here is the back of a car that was moving on its way from Cameroon to Nigeria across the border with 50 kg of marijuana in those sacks and some cocaine in this container. And if you don't really understand what is the connection of all this to wildlife, look very well in the middle and you'll see a baby chimp that is there trafficked in the same exact way. This is an ape trafficker that we were after. Our investigations were discovering that he's also a drug trafficker, and we try to maximize how we arrest him with everything together. In fact, this baby chimp in the middle can fetch far more money than all the drugs combined around it. Once it crosses to Nigeria, once it crosses out of Africa, it will increase its illicit revenue tenfold. So that's big money and connected to other forms of crime, and we have many examples like this. When we arrive usually to countries, and we operate in 10 countries, typically we start looking at prosecutions and the level of wildlife law enforcement, and typically we find 0 wildlife prosecutions. It's kind of shocking for others that look a lot at the media and try to see that there's so much going on wildlife and wildlife crime, but in fact there is a difference between that world and actual facts on the ground. And when we went into the system, getting into conservation with our own attitude and our approach, when we were trying to get an analysis, we're looking at the first obstacle of wildlife law enforcement being corruption, the second one, corruption, and the third one, corruption as well. So by far, corruption was a determining factor in getting this 0 in most of these countries over so many years. And this was not just a problem of African governments, but also conservation. We looked at conservation as ignoring its #1 obstacle, corruption. Corruption for us is daily. This is not a stage photo. This is just one of many photos that we have from our hidden footage, our operation footage, where we deal with bribing attempts. So our approach, as an innovating approach, was to get a specialized law enforcement NGO outfit, law enforcement NGO, and to focus on the traffickers rather than the poachers, and get one strong measurable indicator, because that was what was lacking. Like, what are we looking for when we're thinking about law enforcement? Number of workshops, number of seminars, sensitizations, number of capacity buildings, all sorts of very vague kind of things did not give us real results on wildlife law enforcement. What we chose is number of major traffickers arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. For us, that is the end result of enforcement rather than talking about enforcement. And we focused on fighting corruption, complicity, and impunity, which are usually enabling organized crime. So we have 4 different departments in every country. One department is the investigation departments, where we have undercover investigators infiltrating the trade, trying to get bigger and higher targets, and getting more evidence against them so that we can, and getting trust with them so that we can actually plan a sting operation arresting significant targets. Later on, we have the operation unit where we actually take by the hand police officers, wildlife officers. We don't replace them, but we supervise them in the field. And they are a part of field operations that we are the ones managing, planning. I would say that from theory about corruption, after more than 2,500 traffickers behind bars, our statistics show that 85% of all of the arrest operations, we can tell you who was trying to bribe, who was trying to stop the operation from happening. We don't denounce those 85%. We are not a watchdog group, we are a law enforcement NGO. So we fight corruption in those cases heads on, we intercept them and fight them for this to happen. But imagine how dysfunctional is a police force that does not produce law and order in 85% of the time. Next, we have the legal department in each of these countries, where we have both legal advisors that are there to intercept corruption in courts. And here we have statistics which are pretty much similar. 80% of all of our court cases, we intercept a judge trying to take a bribe, somebody trying to make a file disappear, etc. 80% of the time, the courts do not produce justice. And again, our role is not to denounce it, our role is to fight it. So we intercept and fight, integrating anti-corruption methods to conservation. We also have private prosecutions, so that we basically managing prosecution on behalf of the state, and there we can control the prosecution in a far better way. And we have the media department, where we actually maximize the deterrent value of all of these actions: successful prosecution, successful arrest, optimize the deterrent value of that. So basically, that is what we do. I was trying to give you a little bit of an idea of how wildlife crime actually works, how serious it is, how organized crime is working on it, how it's connected to other forms of crime. Basically, from our point of view, we're trying to push for a paradigm shift in the strategic level, in the bigger picture, to shift more the focus from poachers to big traffickers, to actually get more of those systems, of a bodyguard systems against corruption of these processes, from the beginning of investigation up to execution of sentences, and to advocate for more structures, small, dynamic, cost-effective, to actually be able to shift countries from zero wildlife law enforcement to 1 per week enforcement rate, 1 per week arrest of a wildlife trafficker in a country, in each one of these countries, up to getting them to prison. And of course, setting a very measurable indicator for enforcement, because I think that is what is really lacking, and that's why we get more of the effort of enforcement, or under the title enforcement, more towards sensitization, workshops, etc., which do not really produce a direct link to actual results. We actually advocate against the capacity building approach, and more towards a direct kind of very much committed to a results-oriented approach, where you actually link whatever project you have or whatever investment you have into actual results of enforcement. And of course, to really focus on corruption and to not be shy about it, and to understand that if we need to fight wildlife crime and actually get after those organized crime syndicates, we have to have the fight against corruption in our forefront. And again, fighting against corruption and governance building is really not the same as capacity building, because they're actually two different, almost opposite things. That's basically it shortly. I hope to give you more insights in questions and answers sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ophir, for giving us some insight into how wildlife trade functions on the ground. And for a national and global perspective, we'll turn this over to Sharon.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought you wanted Peter to go next.
I will. Okay, let's step in and have Peter talk a bit about zoonotic disease before we step on to a national security perspective.
Well, thanks very much. And, you know, I want to tip my hat to you, Ophir, for your bravery in doing what you're doing. It's not, you know, people are taking their security and their own risk of their lives to do this work. And I just am in awe of the work you're doing. I want to say personal thanks for what you're doing. Look, we've heard a lot about COVID-19 and the origins of COVID-19. There's a huge debate going on right now about where this pandemic came from. And we don't know the answer. What we do know is the origins of COVID-19 are likely in wildlife, because wildlife carry their own viruses, and there are thousands of species out there, each with their own viruses, and we don't know in most cases what those viruses are. What we do know is there is a pattern to disease emergence that COVID fits absolutely precisely. And I've got a picture of a bat here for a reason. Bats are one of the species that we know seem to carry viruses, some of which are able to infect us. When we look at where emerging diseases begin, and we've done a lot of work on this, other groups have done this too, you can plot out on the planet the origins of every disease that we know about. There are about 500 emerging diseases over the last few decades. Some of these are pandemics, you know, H1N1, so-called swine flu that originated in Mexico with genetic elements of viruses from Europe and North America, the US. Ebola, the others are HIV. Others are smaller outbreaks. Each one of them is a high-risk issue that could become a pandemic. So by plotting them, by correcting for the biases in reporting, we know more people are looking for them in the richer countries. We can balance out where we think these viruses begin. And this is a map of where the emerging disease hotspots are, corrected for the underlying bias in reporting. And when we look at what correlates with these origins, we see a couple of things really stand out. One is that where people are on the planet and where our populations are growing are areas where diseases originate, emerging diseases, where wildlife diversity is highest, which makes sense, because if wildlife carry viruses that have the potential to infect us, the more wildlife species in a region and the more biodiverse places on the planet, the higher the risk. If we then go into those areas and interact with wildlife in ways that drive disease spread, like hunting and killing them, butchering them, for instance. But very importantly, we see that land use change is also a driver. Deforestation, building roads, expanding agricultural production. 30% of all emerging diseases over the past few decades are linked to that process. So, and all of the recent pandemics are of animal origin, driven by human activity. So let's make no mistake about COVID-19. When we have the data in hand, it will probably show that the human hand is behind this virus, the emergence, and it will likely show that anthropogenic expansion on the planet and things like the wildlife trade are a key driver. Why do I say the wildlife trade? Well, if we look at COVID-19, we know that all of the closely related viruses to SARS-CoV-2 originate in bats, horseshoe bats. These are the habitats in China where these bats live. Quite a beautiful part of China, Yunnan province in southwest, with very traditional ways of life that go back thousands of years, but also at the same time, rapidly expanding populations, big cities. This picture is taken next to a bat cave where we've found every genetic element of the original SARS coronavirus in the spike proteins of the viruses in that cave. So these are places where we think that SARS originated, where we expect that COVID originated. This village is literally 2 hours drive from Kunming, a city of almost 10 million people. And there is a new high-speed rail link between Kunming and Myanmar now, driving commerce, driving spread, and driving the wildlife trade. So how does a bat virus get into people in where we know the origins, where the outbreaks seem to have begun, which is the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan. We all saw pictures of this market early on. The first big cluster of cases of COVID tracked back to this market. Now, we don't know if this market is the actual origin of the outbreak, but what we do know is this is one of hundreds, thousands of markets across China, which, when you look at them on the surface, seemingly innocuous. They remind me a lot of the markets, the outdoor markets in the UK, where we would buy our food when I was a kid. And this is normal for China. You know, they call it a seafood market, a wholesale seafood market, but it also sells wildlife. And most markets in China that sell animals often sell them live. They keep them fresh that way. And this market, we know, sold live fish, live amphibians, giant salamanders, a very rare species in China, crocodiles, but also we think live mammals. And the mammals are of the type that we know can carry coronaviruses. This market is the end of a legal trade that mixes illegal trade in with it. But it's an industrial scale production. China started building wildlife farms and promoting it as a way to bring people out of poverty a couple of decades ago. Very successful in terms of poverty reduction. There are now, or at least there were up until this outbreak, about 14 million people employed in wildlife farming, wildlife trading, and markets in China. They're breeding species that we know carry coronaviruses. They're shipping them live all across China into big cities like Wuhan. And we know that was the cause of SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV, the original outbreak. We think there's a pretty good likelihood that this is the cause of the origin of SARS-CoV-2. On the WHO mission to Wuhan that I was part of, and I'm still a member of that team, we looked at all the evidence, and we found substantial evidence that this market, in particular, and many others like it, were selling live mammals of the type that carry coronaviruses. Pictures from papers published in the past, pictures from the internet posted just before the outbreak, and there's a new paper out now in Scientific Reports a couple of weeks ago that says about more than 30,000 live animals per year were coming into Wuhan markets for sale. So there is a substantial risk in doing this activity. China recognized that, and during the outbreak, it made a declaration it was going to close down the wildlife farms for food. And they've done that, and they should be acknowledged for having recognized the risk, public health risk, and doing that. But they've kept a lot open. Breeding animals for traditional Chinese medicine, a huge industry in China, is still allowed. It's a valid industry, but it means the production and killing of rare species. Illegal trade is mixed in with that often, and China does its bit to try and crack down on that, but a lot gets through. And also we know that the fur farms for the fashion trade, which sell to Europe and North America, are still open, and though the animals bred there include coronavirus reservoirs. So there's a lot still to be done. And then there are countries around China that still do this trade openly, and then there is a growth in demand because it's been pushed underground now. So I want to follow what John said and build on what Afir said about the illegal trade. The risk is incredible to our health. We estimate, and this is work from the IPBES pandemics workshop that I was chair of, and IPBES is an international intergovernmental platform for biodiversity and the science behind biodiversity that is pushing the agenda of trying to use science to prevent pandemics, building on some of the efforts around the pandemic treaty. We need to really think about this beyond vaccines and drugs. We need to prevent the underlying drivers. If those underlying drivers are wildlife trade and deforestation, if we prevent them, we get 3 returns on investment. We protect biodiversity and the ecosystem services we get from it. We reduce climate change, and we prevent pandemics. And then we don't have to go through this horror of millions of people dying and our lives ruined for over a year now as we wait for vaccines and drugs to kick in. We estimate that emerging zoonoses cost about $1 trillion annually, maybe more, and it's very hard to get these estimates. We estimate that global strategies focused on deforestation, the wildlife trade, could cost as little as $30 billion annually, 2 orders of magnitude less, a 50-to-1 return on investment. And I think we need to really take this seriously. This isn't just window dressing to say COVID may have come from the wildlife trade, so let's use that in an argument. This is real. This costs lives. This costs an incredible impact on our global economy. And doing something about it will save us money. It's such common sense and such logic that I know all of us around the table get very frustrated that we're not doing that we're not taking it seriously. And we have a ticking clock now to move because people forget quickly. They forgot quickly after H1N1, so-called swine flu. They forgot quickly after Ebola and Zika. It seems like a long time ago we were discussing that. And people, believe it or not, will forget about the impact of COVID. So let's move, let's mobilize, and let's recognize this risk. I just want to finish by saying IPBES is moving forwards with this. We're calling for an intergovernmental council, not on preparedness or control, but on prevention, dealing with the underlying causes. Wildlife trade and deforestation are the 2 big issues. Talking to finance ministries and the World Trade Organization and others. We need a One Health approach to dealing with this. And we need to incorporate these risks into the economic drivers. If the fur trade makes profit from wildlife, but also drives the risk of coronaviruses, then that needs to be incorporated into the decisions around that industry. If land use change for building a factory or a farm or a mine involves the risk of a pandemic that will cost billions of dollars, build that into it and make a decision more intelligently around the rapid desire for economic growth, that some of these things are going to cost us much more in the long term than the profit we make in the short term. And I'll end right there and say thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Peter. So we've looked at the loss of biodiversity, crime, the human health impacts. Let's take a look at wildlife trade through a security perspective. So Sharon, please.
Thank you, Sharon, for letting me go last and also for your own path-breaking work. And I do want to thank Jennifer Turner and Lauren Reese for their leadership in this space and for bringing a conversation like this into the public domain.
Sharon, you froze.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I was just saying that we've gotten a very clear picture from the other panelists today about the ways in which wildlife crime is a security challenge. And I mean security in the most visceral, direct way, and especially for the communities that are closest to those crimes. But what I want to do now is step back, invite you to step back with me to a bigger picture, to look at what security really means. Because everything we've heard about today only scales, only happens if nations act, and more to the point, if they act together. That is always hard. And I would say that arguably now it's harder than it's ever been before. So to put this in an abstract place, if you think of nations as a series of circles in a Venn diagram, you know, the circumference is some kind of boundary, whether it's identity, an idea, a geographic feature, or an arbitrary line on a map. And in that container, all of the people and everything they need to survive and to thrive are, you know, it's commodities like water, energy, materials, but also more intangible goods like wealth, peace, happiness. So these circles all overlap. There are things that societies need that they can't produce alone. So we trade, we take, we build, we share. That includes commodities, but it also includes intangibles like peace. And of course, it includes the commons. It includes atmospheres, oceans. And the relationships in that overlap where we're all, you know, competing for the same things, it is competitive. It's a competitive relationship, and sometimes it's conflictual, but it's often cooperative too. So okay, maybe that's kind of an odd international relations theory, but bear with me, because we're entering a time now. In this post-industrial age, the so-called Anthropocene, where there's a challenge of sufficiency in that overlap. And don't get me wrong, that sufficiency is nothing new. There's a long-standing distributional challenge, an equity challenge, where not everyone, there's always been a problem where not everyone gets enough. But now we have more people who want and need more of everything, who want the standard of living that people in my country enjoy, and so they should. But when you add in industrial age, the size of the population, industrial age expectations, consumption, and industrial age pollution, and the pressure it has put on ecosystem goods and services and on the global commons, all of that pressure, and that includes biodiversity, which I don't think is traditionally considered a commons per se, because it often falls within national boundaries. But there's no question now, listening to the other speakers today, that biodiversity is a very important global commons. And the fact that it's both creates a lot of tension there, both a national good and a common good. And so it's in the nature of our species to be competitive, and that's not all bad. It spurs innovation, it spurs efficiency, clarity of mind and action. But when your predominant challenge is sufficiency, and preserving or restoring the commons, the atmosphere, biodiversity, a zero-sum mindset is pulling us towards a sort of mutual destruction. So we have to have more cooperation. Now, the big challenge with that is that the two biggest circles in the Venn diagram, the two biggest economies, the two biggest militaries, China and America, the overlap between them is growing. And our language about each other, about how we exist in that overlap, is increasingly competitive, increasingly zero-sum. And to my mind, as someone who spent most of my career in the defense sector, we're heading down the road towards conflict. Okay, again, it's in our nature to be competitive. That doesn't have to be destructive. And even conflict is part of human nature. But the prospect of armed conflict between the United States and China is certainly terrible to contemplate about what it might mean. But even worse, this need we have now in the Anthropocene, the need for sufficiency and to protect the commons, means that we need to focus more on cooperation in order to meet that challenge. And it cannot be done without cooperation between the United States and China. So security, especially to people like me coming out of the defense sector, it's always going to be about war and peace, and that's just the way it is. But now we need, certainly in my country, and I think for all countries, a bigger definition of what security is, one that encompasses this compulsion that we have in this time for cooperation. Because this fight to be for sufficiency for the commons is for mutual survival and success. And COVID, we've heard a lot today, and we hear a lot every day about how this is an aspect of that. And I think what the discussion today also certainly emphasized is that one of the aspects of this redefinition of security is what the Biden administration refers to as a rules-based order. I know that is an incredibly bloodless term, what a great American Steve Martin used to call a yawning festival. And, and certainly there's lots of room in there to challenge, well, whose rules and whose order. But what it really means, that this criminality we're talking about today, and the poor governance underneath it, and the corruption that fuel it and drive it, these are undermining global biodiversity and constitute a security challenge for everyone. And I would say arguably an existential challenge if we can't find a way to readdress. So at the biggest level where nations define security and interact together, we need to have a significant redefinition of what it means to be safe and what it means to be secure. So thank you very much, Sharon, for the chance to comment on that.
So to the audience, well, first off, Sharon, thank you so much for those comments. But to the audience, if you have questions, could you please submit them to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. But I have a couple of questions that I'd love to begin with. So to any of you, do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has created greater awareness of wildlife and environmental crime as, both a global security issue and as a health risk? And, what needs to be done to keep it on the radar and actually make some progress towards addressing the issue?
Yeah, Peter Daszak here. I do think so. I think that COVID-19 has reaffirmed what all of us knew in this field was going on globally, that we're driving the emergence of new diseases by our own activities, whether that's through hunting. Oh, can you hear me okay, by the way? Good. Through hunting or through road building or through farming systems, which we see with flu. Now, we don't fully know the details yet, but what it's highlighted is, as people have gone in to investigate the origins of COVID, at the very least, that there is an industrial scale production of wildlife for food. And that, as you said, Sharon, in this Anthropocene, some things are unsustainable, and growing wildlife, mixing them with legal and illegal animals at a scale of that size and shipping them live into areas that are vulnerable, cities where we live in very dense populations, is going to have a risk of delivering pandemics, as it has done before with SARS, Ebola, and many others. So I hope it does, and I hope we continue to recognize that. The evidence will continue to come through about this, and we see new evidence every week.
John, do you have comments on that?
Yeah, I want to come in behind Peter's comments. I think a number of us on this webinar have been in the biodiversity environment space for some time and been struggling to, get into the mainstream agenda to get the sort of change we need to avoid the wholesale loss of biodiversity. I do think this COVID-19 pandemic has seen a lot of governments and corporations and people, the penny has started to drop, that we've got the balance wrong. Something is out of balance. COVID-19 is an expression of that, whatever you say the origins were, because it's highlighted for people that there's all this other science, that we've got that's now in the public domain about the risk from land clearance, interacting with wildlife, et cetera, that Peter's just highlighted today. We had a little bit of that through the connection between biodiversity and climate, but it really was, I think, this COVID-19, certainly from where I sit, that seems to have woken people up. The pennies dropped, but I think the risk we have, and I mentioned this and Peter did as well, we have short memories. And if you don't strike while the iron is hot, the moment will pass. So either now, when people realize that we have these threats, that we need to address these threats, you make fundamental changes to the system to better position you to avoid it happening again, the moment will pass, and then it will be that much harder to do it. So that's why, I think we all need to rally around now. What are the gaps in our system? What are the deficiencies in the system? How do we do what Sharon was referring to? Putting in place new ways and means of cooperating to prevent pandemics, to prevent wildlife crime, for all the reasons of biodiversity, climate, and preventing pandemics. So really now is the moment to move while it's all fresh in our minds. Yeah.
Ophir, you also had something to add?
Yeah, just a small addition from the user side, from those on the ground, where I'm far less optimistic, because even within the COVID time, where everybody understood in Africa, bats, pangolins, all of these things, it was all there, and yet the slaughtering still continued in the market. I can give you an example from Ebola time in Guinea, where in the middle of Ebola crisis in Guinea, we had arrested people with a seizure of 1 ton bushmeat, and some of it was ape meat, slaughtered ape meat. So from that perspective, there's a bit of a mismatch between what people know and how people behave. That is from the user's side of things.
Ophir, to follow up on that, what changes have you seen in species involved in illegal trade, or in smuggling methods or transit routes, over the last couple of decades that you've been on the ground, doing that? And, is there any progress towards identifying poachers before they kill? I mean, what kind of changes do you see on the ground over the last 20 years you've been doing this?
Okay, two things. Let me refer first to the end of your question, where can we catch them before they kill? Well, these kind of syndicates, they are slaughtering machines. We're talking about 300 kilo elephants in my example over a month or 2 months. We don't save the elephants of this month. We save all the elephants of the other months to come. So the poachers, the trafficker that we arrested now in Cameroon, this entire ring, 3 leopard skins is just a snapshot of their weekly outtake. So yes, I have 3 dead leopards in front of me, but I have the satisfaction of thinking this is every week for them. So at least I stopped that. So when we look at criminal activities rather than poachers, because we don't even look at that perspective from the poachers' point of view, but the traffickers, those machines that keep on growing and growing and generate the killing, then stopping them is stopping the killing, although we catch them with what was already killed. As for methods or new dynamics, 2 things. One, first of all, there's always new things. Every day for us or every week for us is something completely new. For 2 reasons. One is because with all the work we do, we just look through the peephole on a far bigger criminality. So being a bit modest, I can say that at any given point, we know just a little bit of a far bigger criminal activity. So when we find something new, we don't say, wow, everything changed. No, we learned something new of something that was there for a long time. And as I was saying, organized crime, for example, was there from the 80s. So a lot of those methods are existing for a very long time. We're just not catching up with them. The second part of it is that there are new products in creation. So the demand-supply dichotomy is a bit of a myth. The idea that some people out there want something all the time and they have a fixed need of it, and there is a supply and they meet, is a gross oversimplification of what trade is, but also is completely wrong for the illegal trade in wildlife from all the data that we have. In fact, when we get this example, I was given $5 million from a container of ivory. This $5 million is invested both in the demand and the supply. The demand is propagated by the same people. The syndicate that you have seen has 1 foot in the demand and 1 foot in the supply. Just like any multinational that you know from your life, they control both and they invest in both. But there are real extreme examples where completely new products have been emerging. For example, for us, one of our arrests when we clamped on, when we attacked a big criminal syndicate, a Vietnamese syndicate in Ivory Coast, we observed a conversation in Viber in Vietnamese between inside the syndicate, and we have seen some plates that were reminding us what is called in tigers tiger cake, which is basically crushed bones, gelatin is out, and you crystallize it again. And they were saying, let's do this for leopards. It doesn't exist, but we can get something like $500 for 10 grams. That's a huge amount of money they were speculating on. And they were discussing creating completely new products for leopards that did not exist at all up to this point. They were trying it. So again, the demand is completely propagated, and that's also developing. So people try to find new markets for animals they can actually exploit.
Thank you, Ophir. We have a question from the audience from Nancy Blaney. What has been the US government response to both wildlife trafficking, national security issues around this, and pandemic health risks? Anyone?
Well, I can just say that, obviously our recent response has been wildly uneven. as we've moved from different presidents who have completely different priorities and different approaches. So and specifically with the pandemic, the Trump administration's response was internally incoherent and moved around between different efforts. So for the US government, I think traditionally we do make an investment and an effort to uphold international treaties and cooperation, and also to work more at the source. What Ophir is talking about as a slaughtering machine obviously takes place in the context of governments that allow it to happen. And that the United States has often targeted rule of law and governance as sort of the headwaters for a lot of these challenges. We have traditionally prioritized that lower relative to where we spend money on, for example, defense systems. So I think Peter is saying that it would cost $30 billion a year to set up effective counter-pandemic measures. There's a single weapon system in the US arsenal called the Joint Strike Fighter that's more than $1 trillion, just that one weapons program. So, we have not necessarily put our priorities and our funding in the places where you build security and prevent this kind of breakdown in civil order as much as we have in being prepared for war fighting. So I think that's been a consistent US asymmetry for a long time. But on the more specifics, I think one of the things that really concerns me is that the United States, certainly is not perfect, but has generally been on the side of rule of law. But if we erode rule of law at home, what does that mean for all of these international efforts? So it's definitely a concern that I have.
I'd like to again invite the audience to submit questions to us at ECSP. What was that? I'm so sorry.
We see Ophir is also giving you a 2-finger there.
Yes. ECSP@wilsoncenter.org is the email address for questions. And Ophir, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, just from an enforcement point of view, I would say that the US is positioned quite in the forefront, looking at it globally. Like if I compare it to Europe, to other places, then both diplomacy-wise and as well as enforcement within the country and internationally, the US is the first one in terms of the results. I was already saying, look, there is a real lack of enforcement, lack of help globally, and I was in all countries, but the US is the first in that, and maybe equal to one European country, but that's basically, that doesn't mean that things do not have to be far better than they are, but to put things in proportions globally, the US is leading it.
John?
Yeah, I mean, seeing we're hosted out of the US today, I'd like to say something positive about the US as well. Certainly during my time at CITES, the US stood up. I remember Senator Kerry, as he then was chair of the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And back in 2011, I think it was, he hosted a meeting on the security implications of illicit trafficking in ivory, elephant ivory. I remember Secretary Clinton held an event, and where she actually did highlight, I think this was 2013, 14, again, my dates are a bit mixed up, where she actually highlighted in this event the health implications of illicit trafficking in wildlife. And the US has stepped up with its support of the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime, which we created back in 2010, a multi-agency initiative. But also let's remember the US has got the Lacey Act. And the Lacey Act is probably the most powerful domestic instrument for dealing with illicit wildlife trafficking domestically. And what we are particularly taken with about the Lacey Act is the it's a criminal, I'm speaking very generally now, but it makes it a criminal offence to import into the US any wildlife or wildlife product if it has been illegally sourced. So you might manage to steal something out of Cameroon or Gabon, but if you try and get into the US, it's a penalty it's a criminal offence under US law to bring it in. That's what we'd like to see in an international agreement on illicit wildlife trafficking. You need to respect the laws of source states. If a source state says it wants to protect wildlife, whether it's endangered or not, it may just want to exploit its timber sustainably for its own benefit. Now, you need to respect that law in other countries so that if someone has managed to steal it out of a source state, they're going to face criminal prosecution at the destination state for having stolen it in the first place. Now, a number of countries, I visited 40 countries, parties to CITES during my time there. What I noticed in many countries was that customs officials would pay no attention to any specimen or species if it was not listed under CITES. CITES only lists 38,000 of the world's 8 million species. Now, a number of them they couldn't identify in the first place because they couldn't distinguish one thing from the other. It might just be left. But otherwise, they didn't look at it. If it was a timber species, a fish species, or anything else that wasn't listed under CITES, it just went through. That's actually facilitating the theft of another country's wildlife. So I think the US, the Lacey Act stands out for me globally as a domestic piece of legislation that has got it right in terms of the way in which it respects and it adopts, if you like, the comity principle, a respect for other people's countries. And we'd like to see that sort of principle enshrined in international law so that every country is going to respect the national laws of every other country in terms of the wildlife that they choose to protect for themselves and to use for themselves.
And if I may be blunt, I mean, I think it's also this moment is an opportunity for China to show that they can bring that kind of accountability and transparency to their own country and their own rule of law. That, you know, this coronavirus could have come from anywhere and may have come from anywhere. But right now, as far as we know from the studies that Peter and others have engaged in, it originated in China. And, you know, again, we've seen compelling evidence today that that is not an accident, that relates to the way that wildlife trafficking and wildlife sales are happening in that country. I don't say that as because I think we should just point the finger and blame China. There's lots of blame to go around. But in this case, they have an opportunity to take this moment and turn it into a better rule of law around these issues. And it would be great to see them to use this moment in that regard.
Yeah, let me add to that. I think Sharon's spot on there. It's very interesting, actually, in the deliberations on the World Health Mission in Wuhan, that this discussion around whether live mammals were sold in the Huanan market was very contentious. I think partly because the market was closed before the scientists went in to investigate. That was a logical series of events, you know, to clean it out and protect the public. I think any wildlife trader with live mammals would have shifted them out so they don't die and so they can get a better price somewhere else. But the fact that we had some evidence that they were sold there and there was nothing illegal about it, you know, there's just a very great sensitivity in China around this issue because of the political pressure around COVID origins. But it's a fact that the wildlife trade, the wildlife industry, it's an industrial scale production of 14 million people working in it. And again, China did close them down. They closed down the markets, more or less. So, you know, I don't know why people aren't using that in China and around the world to say that's what should be done and that's a good thing, and try and build on some of that bonhomie and goodwill that could come from that diplomatically. You know, just one last comment. We cannot forget that we're part of this too. And although, you know, we all probably around the table here don't eat wildlife products, you know, of the type that are sold in markets in Southeast Asia. Many of us have seen when we go on a winter trip or a ski trip, we see people with the fur trims on the collars. Look at the labels. It's quite likely that's a raccoon dog bred in a farm in Russia or China that's a coronavirus reservoir. That industry was kept open because it's so profitable. So the cycle of consumption, overconsumption, unsustainable consumption, driven by us as much as anyone else, is partly to blame. So let's look at everything we do and come together. And certainly we are going to have to work together to find out really what happened with COVID and to actually do something about issues like the illegal wildlife trade. Critical.
You make an important point, Peter. I think few people realize that although it's a very different market, the US is the second largest consumer of illegal wildlife in the world, for example. So our behavior does drive trade.
Yeah, we analysed it a few years back and published a policy forum in Science. It's quite incredible. It's millions of animals a year coming in live into the US from emerging disease hotspots with almost zero health checks on the way. And thanks to CITES, at least they're assessed for endangered species status. But there are something like 4 notifiable diseases at the time we did this study. And no one's checking them for unknown, potentially dangerous pathogens. And we have had emerging diseases here from the wildlife trade, monkeypox from the pet trade, and Ebola restin from the lab animal trade, among others.
So we have another question from the audience, from Anne Moisen. Since security is the easiest driver of change within most countries, what kind of argument should we be making to countries to recognize the true threats of wildlife trade? And again, for anyone, which countries have good laws and are doing a good job enforcing them?
Just on the security argument, I think that you can look at the wildlife trade and recognize that it is both a symptom and a driver of larger problems about corruption, about poor governance in undergoverned spaces, destabilizing influences, and these things all constitute security threats within borders, across borders, and at a geopolitical level. So, going to countries and saying that the kind of trade that everyone's been talking about here today, that Ophir has been most, visceral about, it drives criminality, it drives corruption, it drives poor governance, but it's also a symptom that those things are happening. And so if you do not address it, you are not addressing all of the things that constitute stability, instability, and conflict that crosses borders. So, it all goes to the same place, I would say.
Ophir?
Yeah, I completely agree with Sharon. It's a cross-cutting issue. So when we look at it as we have an opportunity to deal with far larger issues when we deal with wildlife. So when we manage to get a magistrate behind, a magistrate revoked, then that is a first for the entire system. So it builds law and order. When we are looking at border issues and we make an arrest showing that it costs just less than $100 to move in whatever you want to move across the border. So why do we need a border security if that's what you can do? So I believe those things are really linked, and when we fight wildlife crime, we manage to solve a lot of other issues as well. And those people who can get everything on a plane with contraband can get any contraband. So it's the same exact problem. And as for the laws, I just want to say that from our perspective, the laws in many places are good laws. You can give imprisonment for wildlife traffickers, especially in Africa, where almost all countries have very sufficient laws. The problem of lack of application is far bigger of a problem than improving laws themselves. If you have a law and the law is not applied for a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades in those countries, then the real problem is once you have corruption, your systems are pretty much worthless, even if you have very good laws.
Ophir, do you know of any similar groups to Eagle Network that are operating in Asia? And, what are, the difficulties, in creating, both local enforcement groups like this and a network, especially an international network of these enforcement agencies groups?
Well, there are other NGOs that are doing things that are similar in a way that are attacking wildlife crime. Freeland is one of them, EIA is another. There's more that we are also trying to exchange with, trying to work together on. I think the big problem that is there everywhere in the world, that at least there in Asia, in other places, which I didn't really understand at first, was that corruption is a real obstacle also elsewhere. I started working from Central Africa, and my point of view was that, wow, here corruption is really strong, and there's such very strong obstacle for enforcement. That's why nothing happened. And we started moving to other places, and we've seen in Africa, and we've seen the situation is exactly the same. And when we cooperate with other groups in Asia, we see the same things, that a lot of the efforts are good efforts on investigations and trying to even get an arrest, later on fail in court because of corruption. But building the trust between the groups is also not that easy. It's rare to find groups which are very much oriented solely on getting the end result, traffickers behind bars. And a part of it is because of donors policy as well, which takes the NGOs to maybe the comfort zone for donors, which is capacity buildings and many more workshops and much more seminars and much more talking, and more of those unmeasurable activities relating to enforcement.
We have another question from the audience from Candace Famigliera. Many of the efforts seen in the media to address illegal wildlife trade seem to be focused on militarization and the war on wildlife. However, studies suggest that the majority of poachers do so because of relative poverty. Again, we're not talking about the kingpins of this question, right? Why the disconnect? Are there any efforts by major international organizations focused on workforce development and fighting wildlife crime by providing alternative livelihoods for poachers? Does anybody, John, speak to that?
Yeah, thanks for that. And just want to start by supporting what Afia said about focusing on the traffickers. So looking at bringing down syndicates. And we've seen some very good work in different countries, from the US to Malawi to China, actually, in investigating, leading to prosecution and convictions, but also not just looking at the wildlife crime, looking at it as a predicate offence in terms of investigating financial crimes. So issues to do with money laundering, etc. And that's an area where we've been trying to push to get more emphasis on that, because you actually want to hit them where it hurts, and it's the profit incentive. So do the financial investigation, address these issues of money laundering, and confiscate the assets that they've derived from their crime. So there's a lot of aspects to this, and hats off to Afia for having some key performance indicators. I was first special envoy for this organisation, African Parks. I still have their water bottle that I used to take out in the field when I was allowed to get out in the field. What they do is they take on the long-term management of protected areas on the African continent. They have basically agreements with governments that are between 20 and 50 years, because they believe you have to be in a place for a long time if you're going to have any discernible impact. And a bit like Ophir, they're very focused on results. And that is, they look at results from the point of view of the state of the ecosystem, the number of species, the number of rangers, field days, arrest, delivering people for prosecution, right through to issues to do with the community. How many community members are employed? How many enterprises have they stimulated? For example, they'll be involved. I was in Akagera in Rwanda. The rangers and the tourists there were consuming X hundred of eggs, chicken eggs per day. I can't remember how many. They were flying them all in from Kigali, the capital. But they worked with the local community to create a cooperative. So they brought all their chickens together and they started buying the eggs from the locals. Now, they did the same with fish. They've done the same with bees and honey. There's a policy that you recruit locally. They're also looking at the provision of water supply, electricity, etc., so that locals are deriving a benefit from the protected area and from the wildlife. They are the primary beneficiaries of that effort. But you have to be there for a long time. You have to have the right philosophy. You have to be focused on results, and you have to be focused on ensuring that you are working in sync. So as we used to say, you get the mandate from the government, but you get the ongoing informal license to operate from the community. And they quite rightly ought to be the primary beneficiaries. But you have to measure it, because there's a lot of work that goes in, just throwing money at something, but not actually knowing what it's delivering. And they had about 100 indicators right across the board, whether it's enforcement or ecological condition or species or employment or healthcare, because there was a huge effort on healthcare. So I think African Parks is a great example of what you can achieve when you've got the right mindset, and when you're prepared to, you go in not for a couple of weeks, couple of months, fly in, fly out conservation doesn't work. You're there for a minimum of 20, most likely 50 years to have a discernible impact.
So we're winding down towards our final time here, and we're going to need to wrap up. But I would like to hear very briefly from each of you. What do you think is the most important intervention needed to stem wildlife trade, protect wildlife, ecosystems, and human health? John, should we start with you?
I was hoping to think about it for a while. No, look, I think we have to work at all levels. I think I'm just focusing at the moment on the international level. It has to happen in the field. So I'm 100% with Ophir on that. But we also, as Sharon said, we need to get these cooperative arrangements in place at a global level so that we're working together towards common objectives. So I believe we have a system that is not fit for purpose in terms of addressing pandemics, biodiversity, and climate change. We need to put in place wildlife trade regime that takes a One Health approach. Perhaps the international pandemics treaties, the place to do that, and also wildlife crime. We need to embed it in the international criminal framework so that we've got all countries agreeing how they're going to cooperate, how they're going to share information, and how they're going to work to prevent these crimes, including criminalizing the import. So respecting the national laws of states and protecting all species, not just CITES listed species that are found in international trade. And let's strike while the iron's hot. We have to move now.
Briefly, Ophir?
Just today, my deputy director in Cameroon was getting vaccinated. And what he has seen there is that he can actually get a permit that he was vaccinated without it paying a bribe. Listen to that. This is just today in Cameroon. So when I say corruption, it's not about enforcement. If we do not put corruption in the forefront of what we do, we will fail, no matter what we're doing if we work internationally. So that is my first point, putting corruption in the forefront and integrating anti-corruption techniques to anything that we're doing. And secondly is measurable standards. I think that we have enough resources. There's so much activities. I see, from my point of view, huge waste. And that can be solved through measurable standards and very clear indicators of what it is about. And the end result of what we're looking for, not just something in between, and looking at talking about the problem as a good step in the right direction. I don't think it's a good step in the right direction. I think that we've seen a lot of these good steps in the right directions moving in a circle, finding ourselves in the exact same spot. It's about getting real change in the field, getting real change, reality changes, and having indicators for it.
Thank you, Ophir. Peter?
Well, I think that we've got to, here in the US and in the richer countries around the world, really wake up and stop trying to blame a country, a behavior, or a specific group of people for what's killing us right now, COVID-19, and recognize that we're all part of this. The easy solutions that involve China did this, or it happened there, so there's something wrong about their behavior. It's an easy solution. It's not the real solution. The real solution is complex, difficult to understand, and involves us. So we have to recognize our role in this. The choices we make when we go to the supermarket, when we decide whether to fly or not, when we buy that fur trimmed jacket so we can look cool on the ski slopes, it's driving loss of biodiversity, climate change, and pandemic risk. And until we recognize that, we're going to continue to suffer in the age of pandemics. And don't be fooled by the messages we'll get from people like me, scientists, who will say, yeah, we did really well with that vaccine. Next time it'll be even quicker. As we waited for a vaccine 1.5 years, millions of people died. Preventing pandemics is what we've got to do. Just like we don't wait for a heart attack to go to the gym, we prevent it. That's what we've got to do to pandemics, and we need to wake up and recognize that. And I think we're getting there, but please move quickly.
Thank you, Peter. And Sharon?
I don't disagree with Peter, but let's be realistic here. A government that does not have rule of law, doesn't enforce its own laws, doesn't deal with criminality is probably also not providing opportunity to more people. This is a governance problem, and there are governments that are more to blame than others, and all governments have to lean into dealing with this challenge and with the whole suite of challenges, the way that the Anthropocene is degrading our commons and our ability to thrive as a species. This is a challenge of governance at its heart. Corruption is an aspect of governance. So this is about nations and the way they act.
This is certainly a topic that warrants far more discussion, but we've come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank our panelists, John Scanlon, Ophir Drury, Peter Daszak, and Sharon Burke for joining us today. Jennifer, I believe you have some closing remarks.
I get 5 seconds. Again, everyone's been thanked. It was wonderful. ECSP and CF are going to continue to keep these conversations going. And again, bravo for all the work that you guys are doing on this front. And thank the audience for tuning in today. You can watch the webinar later online and keep your eyes open for more meetings in the future. Thank you, everyone.